Okay, I think we'll start because I can see that most people are here. So welcome to this, and this is a look at just how much the coronavirus pandemic has really changed the attitudes and behaviours of people, based on the Ipsos Global Trends Survey that we originally launched back in February. That COVID-19 did actually sink into the report. It was there, but it was only mentioned briefly. And clearly, since February, when we launched this major report, a lot has changed. So in terms of what we're looking at, do post questions in chat. If you've got any questions and observations, those will be passed to me. And if something strikes you as really crazy, then please tell us. But in terms of where we're going, I think, we've seen massive changes in human behavior. I mean, most of you will be sitting at home. Many of us have shut our offices. We did a survey recently for the Confederation of British Industry, and British business as a whole is planning to reduce its office space by about 20%, which on its own is pretty phenomenal. So we can see, of course, massive changes in behavior. The growth in e-commerce forced on us by the pandemic, more growth in many markets than in the previous 6 years, was achieved in just 6 months. But the question is, are people really changing? And now the vaccine's here, will we actually suddenly, when it finally gets distributed and when most people take it, we can talk about vaccine hesitancy if you want to, but when the vaccine's here and the disease starts to become a distant memory, what will have changed? So this is what we're trying to look at in this. And it's certainly true that there have been a lot of hot takes in the media and elsewhere about how the world of work will change forever. It really has changed the world forever. We need a revolution for a born-again world. COVID-19 has changed everything. How we exercise is different now. The pandemic changed everything. Coronavirus, the pandemic has changed our perception of time. I'm still trying to work that one out. The pandemic will change everything. America 2.0, it will change staff development forever. It's changed youth activism. So you name it, you can read about how the pandemic will change everything. But we are a bit less convinced of that. One of the things that we did over the summer, and some of you who are regular Ipsos MORI watchers will have seen this before, is look at how in Britain, the country I know best, values had or hadn't changed from the last century. So we went back to 1999, and obviously we could see that access to the internet has massively shot up over the last 20 years. But you're comparing a society before the war on terror, before Facebook, before Spotify, before WhatsApp, before the global financial crisis and the rise in inequality, or certainly the freeze in real wages in many countries that was the longest on record, or since, in Britain's case, since the Napoleonic Wars. And yet, over that period, the proportion of people who wanted to slow down the pace of their life, despite all of that technology and the arrival of the iPhone, that hadn't changed. The proportion who felt that technical progress was just destroying our lives, that hadn't changed. And even being a big boss, would that make you happy? That hadn't changed. So we need to be careful, I think, about assuming that, really some of the changes we've seen in e-commerce, in retail, etc., the changes in our use of offices are symptomatic of a bigger change in society. When we look at change, of course, there are all the known knowns, the things that fundamentally drive it, that affect us all over the world and are changing our societies. And again, many of these aren't necessarily completely upended by the virus. We know there will be more Nigerians than Americans in a few years, however many Americans ultimately are killed by the virus. We know that Europe will be the oldest continent on Earth, and for the marketeers on this call, we really need to try and sell more to the over 50s. Speaking as an over 50 myself, there will be, if the over 50s of Europe were a sovereign nation, they would be the 3rd richest country on Earth. And yet we still think it's all about youth. Growing inequality and opportunity was something we identified before the pandemic hit, of course. It's one of the major challenges in Western societies, and indeed, but even more dramatically in some cases in Latin America and parts of Asia. And that really, that was there before, but has been exacerbated by the virus. People with money and secure jobs, able to work at home, like many people on this call, will have often saved money during 2020. But in contrast, those who've lost jobs or who saw their sector particularly affected have been spending their savings. So we've seen massive differences in terms of who gets exposed to the virus and dies. And these trends are not necessarily going to go away. Geopolitical tensions, even with Donald Trump almost certainly having lost the American election, even if he doesn't think so himself. We've just done a poll that shows that 79% of Americans believe he has lost, including most Republican, but not all, but most Republican voters. But certainly relations between America and China are not going to improve massively, even with Joe Biden there. Relations between Russia and Europe are not necessarily going to improve massively under any new presidency. So those geopolitical tensions, a very different world from the 1990s, are going to persist. The data world, as we've called it, which we're all part of course, in our industries, is just going to keep accelerating. I've been really struck this year by Moore's law being replaced by a new one that shows even faster growth in processing power, and the implications of that and mass storage, and what that will mean for AI finally cutting through in the 2020s with those technological tipping points that, of course, we can all see coming our way. And then the thing that I, being silly, had thought was going to be the big issue this year, the fragile planet and climate change, which, of course, is, we've seen more evidence with Arctic ice forming later than ever, massive releases of methane, and, of course, plenty of fires, floods, etc., and extreme weather events during the year. So those are the knowns in a way. But in terms of our theory of change and what's happening, these are all going on. Human society, of course, then responds, and we can see those signals of change. COVID has been this massive shock to the system. And the question really is, how much have our fundamental values, motivations, and attitudes shifted as a result of COVID-19? Is the world completely different? And to check that, what we've done is choose 7 major markets and to go back to the questions that we looked at in the launch of the survey back in February. There's the website that some of you would have seen with most of the data on. And what we're doing here is just looking at 7 different markets. This is data from October, so it's very recent. And it's just looking at where each market is on our essentials tracker, where we look at how people are feeling in terms of getting ready, how they've adjusted and acclimatized, whether they've restarted or reached a new position. And so the markets we've decided to look at, and we're particularly looking at today, are Italy, France, and Germany. Very different experiences, of course, of the pandemic, with the Germans, probably coming off best. The Italians, really shocked by the first lockdown and the deaths in Lombardy and the scenes that we all saw in April of, army trucks taking away bodies. For those of you who've watched our blindsided video would have seen some of that footage and reactions to it. Those countries there's Britain, we're sort of more, some of us are in the middle of acclimatization. Some in October we're getting ready for the second lockdown. Here's Brazil and America, both experiencing the virus but acclimatizing to it. And then, of course, China, where there are now pool parties in Wuhan and concerts going on. China, in some ways, the most successful country in terms of controlling it, although at the price of civil liberties that most of the other countries on this chart would not tolerate. But nevertheless, one has to say that China has been incredibly successful. And so there they have the highest proportion of people saying that they're doing most of the things they did pre-COVID. But what we've seen, of course, is still, even in China, very big changes in values because of some of the events in this year. So in terms of global trends, what it does is ask hundreds of questions, which we then sort into 36 values. On this chart, it's very unlikely that if there are 2 values that are a long way apart, that you would find somebody in one individual who shared them both, that had strong faith in capitalism on the left here, but also was very keen on wealth redistribution, or was tired of environmentalism, but also very concerned about climate emergency. And so what you can see are these groups. Many people on this call will probably be sharing some of these values around early adoption, data sharing, perhaps believing capitalism is, despite its faults, one of the best systems, believing in science and medicine, liking technology. Over here, and this I think is one of the challenges in many societies, is that a completely different set of values, very worried about the future, feeling overwhelmed, left behind, up for a populist revolution against the elites, worried about data, nostalgic for the past. Over here, of course, the values of Mr. Trump, tired of environmentalism, believing that women should know their place and they have a different role than men, believing in his country, right or wrong, make America great again, real world shopping, the values of Bolsonaro, Marine Le Pen, etc. And you know, and in America, a record number of Republicans turned out and voted for Donald Trump. Those people haven't gone away. Things haven't particularly shifted. And that's one of the things that we'll come to in the survey. Those divisions that you can see here are still real. And although Joe Biden has won in America, and although in the work that we do globally, tracking populism every year, we've seen a small global movement back from it, the loss of the future, I think, is one of the most striking things in my career that our societies are faced with, and it's why so many people are so angry. And the reason for that is that in Western societies, most people believe that the next generation should always be richer than the current one. And yet today we have in Britain, where I'm sitting now, 45% of us expect our children to be poorer than us. And that makes us angry and wanting to blame somebody. And then finally on this chart, the other group of people are those with very radical values, believing in beyond binary, which is a cluster of things around very strong belief in trans rights, very strong belief in gender equality and LGBTQI rights. And interestingly, they're quite a long way. If you're very strong on trans rights, you're quite a long way away from everything else, except climate emergency. In the middle are these things around consumption, conscious eating, provenance, individualism, discerning consumption. And again, those are in some ways more mainstream values, right at the center of the chart. And those again, we'll see how they're changing. So those are the values, 36 of them that we identified through endless iterations of analysis on the survey. We crunch those into 12 trends, and what we can see now is how these 12 trends are changing. So we've got climate antagonism, those who are concerned about the climate, but also the minority who are very angry and think that too much fuss is being made about it. Conscientious health, being concerned about what you eat and your health. We'll see how that changes. Authenticity is king, so important to the brands on this call that you must, you cannot say one thing and do another thing, and this search for business with purpose. Data dilemmas and the tech dimensions from my colleagues at Google on the call, this sort of both rising data apathy that we saw over the last decade, people accepting that they're going to lose privacy, it's almost inevitable, wanting to regulate big tech in the tech dimension. We'll see how that changes. And then, of course, peak globalization, even before what has happened this year, which has exposed our supply chains. We had seen many people wanting to, reverse globalization, particularly in the Midwest of America and places like France. And then, of course, a divided world over values, capitalism's turning points, how people react to all this uncertainty, the appeal of nostalgia, and that hasn't changed, actually. It hasn't got stronger, but it hasn't gone away either. Similarly, the search for simplicity and meaning, the human condition almost. But again, one of the strongest values that we saw before the pandemic, and again, it hasn't changed. And then choices over healthcare. So where we've seen change, in fact, is particularly focused on these 6 dimensions around brands, around health and healthcare, interestingly around climate, around globalization, and how people are coping with all of this uncertainty and also perceived inequality. So let's have a look at this. And the first thing is on the climate emergency. When we went into lockdown and when the first sort of signs of the virus were clear, our spontaneous tracking of environmental concern fell off a cliff. And the reason for that, and it happened in 2008, is that when people are immediately faced with losing their job, just worried about how they're going to pay the bills, or indeed a deadly respiratory disease that could kill millions of people, at that point, longer term concerns about climate change, of course, fall away. But what's interesting is when you dig below the surface, when you start to talk about the recovery that we might have, or indeed just the threat of climate change, we can see it's absolutely there. So in terms of signals that we're observing around the world, it's all going on. IKEA's Buyback Friday, where they're going to buy your old furniture to help with the recycling efforts. The British Medical Association and the Royal Colleges talking for a tax on beef, meat, but in particular beef. The carbon associated with beef and the attention being focused on that is part of the reason why sausage rolls are now supplemented by vegan sausage rolls at a chain like Greggs in Britain. So now these medics are now calling for meat just to be tax to stop people eating it, both for carbon and health reasons. And even in America, where Trump has been reversing climate change legislation, the renewables have actually now overtaken coal. And what, climate change was our strongest value. If you look at all of those values mapped by their intensity that we could see, before we went into lockdown, climate emergency was the one that people on the planet were most likely to share. They didn't necessarily agree on solutions, but they agreed it was real, and it was far stronger than the proportion who were also tired of environmentalism. Although you'll notice that 77 and 43, when you add them together, come up to more than 100. And so some of the people who believe in climate change are also tired of people talking about it. But nevertheless, that was the #1 value. And what we've seen is that COVID actually hasn't dented that concern that we've seen rising in many countries like Britain and America and indeed China. If anything, it's gone on rising. So we're heading for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. More and more people agree. They mostly believe that someone else needs to make a change, and that business and government can do more than they can, but they are willing to see those changes made. So COVID has not changed climate change concerns. What it has done is make us, of course, in many ways, predictably, more concerned about healthcare, but it hasn't necessarily damaged trust in science. So we can see, of course, all of these signals, micro fashion brands like Burberry offering you stylish masks, people queuing up already in China, even before the Pfizer vaccine was announced yesterday. You've got queues for an experimental vaccine in China, in the city where it's being launched. And Regeneron's share price shoots up after it cured Donald Trump for long enough for him to go back on the campaign trail. So health has moved up the agenda. You can see more people in all of these countries that we've been checking in on saying that they will sacrifice convenience if it means they're going to get healthier products. So people really thinking about what they eat. And there is a chance in the psychological moment, I think, of COVID-19, as people appraise their weight. I certainly have. I'm 6 kilos down in the second lockdown, having put on 6 kilos in the first lockdown. People reappraising their health and their weight, but also their financial position. And I think for a lot of companies, brands, organizations, there is a moment here for people where people are taking stock about their lives. Do I like paying so much money for a mortgage on a flat in the middle of London or in New York or Paris when actually I could live further away possibly? And so health is being considered as part of that general psychological moment. We've seen, interestingly, a fall in faith in vaccines, particularly in America, but also in Italy and in France and in Britain. And whether that's just anxiety about things being rushed to market, we know that most people say they will take the new vaccine when it comes out. But this rising vaccine hesitancy and the strong link between right-wing politics and the anti-vaxxers is really perhaps quite concerning in terms of the rollout of the vaccine and achieving herd immunity. But certainly it's down. But interestingly, of course, we haven't seen a drop in the proportion of people who believe all medical conditions will ultimately be curable. So we're optimistic generally about science. We've seen in many countries rising trust in science. So in all of these markets, more people say actually ultimately the science will work. And although in some countries the politicization of the treatment of the virus has seen some of the individual scientists' credibility affected, overall, I think the long-term trend that we've seen in so many countries of a rising trust in science will keep going. That looks, and where we see existing trends almost accelerated than with the virus, then I think, again, we can be more confident about it. In terms of brands, doing what you say, saying what you do and doing what you say and being real are absolutely there. We've seen a rise in the proportion of people who say they want to buy brands that reflect their personal values, up from 56 to 72%, where I'm sitting here. And when business is being tested in moments of crisis, people remember how brands behaved. As always, crises like this are generally good for supermarket brands, but it's really interesting. We've got a 6-point rise in the proportion of people who want bosses to speak out on social and political issues. Not all bosses themselves want to do that or put themselves in the line of fire, but certainly the public seems to want people to do that. And generally, you're seeing people saying that they want to spend more for a brand that has an image that appeals to them. And again, in nearly all these markets, that figure's gone up. So people are thinking about brands as they come out of this, but they're also interested in brands being true to purpose, and particularly brands that align emotionally with consumers. We've also seen unprecedented shifts in consumer drivers of purchase during lockdown, and I think this is really interesting. So whether you're looking at snacking or OTC, whether you're looking at drinks or infant formula milk, or indeed financial services, very different categories. But what's interesting, when my colleagues shared this with me, I was thinking, look, gives me peace of mind, a trusted brand, it makes me feel good or understands my needs. Less important here, comes in a wide variety of flavors. So peace of mind, security, it can be shared with friends. And in banking, interestingly, aligned with my principles, the brand has integrity. So you can see these words of trust making me feel good. You know, there's something here around comfort, security, doing the right thing that seem to be standing out. And these shifts, my colleagues who have been looking at these things for a very long time tell me that we've seen in a single year in these categories are stronger than we've ever seen before. So, you know, interesting to see this, some of the things that we're seeing in global trends reinforced in other studies. Overall, of course, retail is going through a very difficult moment. E-commerce is up, as I say, more in 6 months than in the previous 6 years in many, many markets. We have seen the rate of closures of physical retailing doubling, and the lockdown isn't helping. But we've also seen, interestingly, in the study, because we forced so many people into online shopping for the first time in many markets with the closure of the physical economy, we've actually got more people saying they find shopping online more difficult. And so France, Germany, particularly Italy, not so much in China, but China is, you know, compared to many of these older Western markets, a fully digital economy in comparison. But they're actually saying that, you know, these new adopters often finding it more difficult. I don't think that means that they're going to row back massively, although we did see a small fall in e-commerce once lockdown stopped, because people then had the choice about going back to physical retail again. But it's true that when you look at Gen Z, it isn't just older people, actually. We've got Gen Zs in France and Germany as well, and Britain, all more likely to say that actually during lockdown, they found it more difficult to get what they wanted online than in traditional shops. So, you know, there is certainly something. There is, you know, physical retail is down but not out. What we are seeing, however, is a rebalancing of global and local. And I think this is particularly challenging for businesses that are global and that are thinking particularly about markets like China. So the first thing is this rise in national pride. Only America saw national pride go backwards. And this, of course, is during a very long and pretty unpleasant presidential campaign. We took this poll just before the American election. So people not feeling particularly proud in America, but in China, in Brazil, in Italy, in Germany, people more likely to say that they're really proud of their country, often tied to how the pandemic's being dealt with. Britain, a bit more so-so. And other work that we've done in terms of rating of political leaders during the pandemic has shown a similar sort of ranking, actually, with Germany at the top and America at the bottom. Angela Merkel has ratings as a leader that most people, even Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, would give their right eye for. 79% satisfied. You know, find me a politician apart from Jacinda Ardern, both women, interestingly, in New Zealand, who gets ratings like that. But overall, national pride seems to have gone up. And interestingly, we haven't seen a reversal on globalization. We've seen a long-term trend actually in more people saying, despite everything, that globalization is good for their country. And so, despite nationalism and Make America Great Again, overall, we can see it's really only the French who really don't like globalization, but they've never been keen on it. 8 years ago, we had only 24% in France saying that globalization was good for them. But for everybody else, it's sort of gradually drifting up. Britain up from 41% to 54% over this period. And the pandemic doesn't seem to have made us suddenly say, no, we've got to build autarky. In other words, where each country is a sort of ring-fenced system. Having said that, so globalization continues in many ways, but people are a bit more likely to say that they want to buy locally made products, particularly products made in their country rather than products from abroad. British at one end, but 86% in China, and that's gone up 15 points, quite marked. And I think some of this is resilience, some of this is national pride, some of this is trade wars, some of this is a retreat to sort of known and familiar products, some of it is trying to, you know, perhaps worrying about supply chains. But overall, it's a fairly clear trend. So how you relocalize, or if only in your branding, is important. And thinking that global brands are better than local ones, you can see in China a big fall, down 50 to 34 in terms of that proportion. That's where the fall has been most marked. Brazilians seem to be even more likely to say that global brands make better products than ones that are just local country. But Italy a bit more likely to go to disagree that global brands are better. Everywhere else it's a minority anyway, but that big shift in China will be worth watching as we go forward in terms of that shift in national pride and China, China ahead of everything else. The other thing that we've seen is wanderlust going up. I would like to experience living in different parts of the world. The proportion of people who agree with that has gone up virtually everywhere. And whether that's just a reaction to lockdown, we'll see. But if 8% more of the Chinese population, when air travel starts to resume, and it may be as soon as next year, maybe, I see that Ryanair are now predicting that their numbers will be back to 2019 levels as early as next year. Now the vaccine's available. That might just be PR fluff, but certainly, there is that desire to travel. So if all the Chinese are going to get on an aircraft and start moving again, then we are going to see a very rapid return in some ways to normal. We may not. Business travel may take much longer to recover, but certainly consumers look like that there is pent-up demand in lockdown, and we can see that everywhere. Even the Germans, a big rise in Germany and interest in moving around. So overall, I think what it's reminding us is that big picture values are really slow to change. In terms of what it means for next year, on the near term, I'm not going to try and make predictions for the rest of the 2020s at this moment. I think there are huge choices around government stimulus. Governments are going to be able, one of the trends that we've already seen is big government. Governments are spending money now at the level that they normally only spend in world wars. And with interest rates so low, they can continue doing that for some time. Both Joe Biden, the Green Party, Boris Johnson, you name it, all talk about building back better, often with a stress on green infrastructure. Often also the rhetoric around green infrastructure, green energy, digital infrastructure, the rhetoric often doesn't match what the actual spending plans are. But certainly one could see, business governments trying to reflate using the need to do something about achieving net zero on carbon as one of the efforts. And we will certainly see government spending and healthcare spending at levels that were well ahead of the pre-pandemic level for some time to come. But clearly it hasn't changed everything. We've got these massive behavioural shifts that we've gone through, but not attitudinal ones. If the vaccine is very quickly available early next year, lots of businesses will try and pivot back to how they were before. Whether consumers will want to go with them, I think, and workers want to go with them is another matter. I think a lot of people don't want to go back to 5 days in an office. We can see that, most people in surveys that we've done of business are predicting a blended office and home environment in future. What we can see is, I think, a continued importance of the role of brands, but perhaps more expectations of them to provide comfort, security, and familiarity during the pandemic. Clearly a focus on health and things like nutraceuticals rising very rapidly, people wanting to make sure that they're ready for the virus. This need, particularly when incomes are going to be squeezed in many cases, even if the economies recover, that need for comfort and security and familiarity looks to be strong. How we provide resilience matters, and clearly there is a real interest in localism. Things that sort of provenance was always there, but it seems to have been strengthened by the virus. What isn't changing, as far as we can see at the moment, certainly environmental concern. All of those measures that government will have to take to drive us towards net zero and to achieve the targets looks to be there, and consumers are willing to be led. They won't necessarily pay more, but they are willing to be led. Interestingly, attitudes of technology, despite our absolute dependence now on things like MS Teams, Zoom, etc., we haven't become more negative about a big tech. If anything, we're exactly where we were. We still want it regulated. We haven't become more concerned about data privacy, despite spending 8 to 9 hours a day staring at a small screen with even more of our lives taking place online. Data apathy, if anything, has actually gone on rising, this acceptance, and by that I mean the trend that we identified of rising acceptance of just the loss of privacy. And then finally, the other thing that hasn't changed, and which is why our politics is going to carry on being difficult during the 2020s, and I think we just don't know what's going to happen, is ideological divides. Those, between conserving particularly over culture, and moving forward. We've seen over Black Lives Matter and debates about inequality, both inside businesses and in society, during 2020, I think they've been sharpened by experiences in COVID-19. A lot of people not willing to put up with the way things were before. And so those ideological divides are still there. The American election shows that Trump, people aren't voting for Donald Trump because they think he's a lovely, decent man who's going to bring people together. They're voting for Donald Trump because he seems to hate the same people they do. And they feel left behind and left out, and nobody was listening to them. Those divides, I'm afraid, are still there. How they play out in our politics, of course, is not clear. It took about 4 or 5 years after the 2008 crash for the wave of populism that we're still seeing the aftermath of to sweep across the world. And if there are going to be very severe economic impacts from the pandemic, and indeed the digital acceleration with winners and losers, that will mean the 2020s will continue to be really interesting. But as I'd say, we're only, we're less than a year into this. If we were talking last November, we wouldn't be talking about half this stuff. We know that the most adaptive businesses, those people, all of you on this call, will be the ones that do best out of it. But we will keep looking. But I think it's reassuring in one way that the world hasn't completely changed, but there are certainly things that we can measure and see, and we're here to help. So if you want to ask any questions, I think post them in chat. My colleagues will whiz them through to me, and otherwise you can go and have your lunch. So someone's asked what interpretation can be made using the conceptual framework of global trends regarding social outbreaks in different countries, as in the case of Chile, and that's a good question. One of the things that both Global Trends shows and Ipsos's other work on social values is that actually the most, which is certainly a trend in human society, is that actually the countries that are most interested in populism are actually in places like Latin America. Britain and America, despite its divides, is actually less interested in populism than many of the Latin American countries like Colombia, Peru, Chile, where we've seen massive demonstrations over the last year or so. And a lot of that is because, again, people not seeing the growth that they were hoping for, and being worried about inequality. So that, I think, is a huge issue. Somebody's asking, for those of us working in climate change policy, what do you see as being the most important changes? Seems co-benefits and infrastructure changes still most relevant. I would agree with that. And I think the need to, people have given latent, and there are so many examples of it. There is latent permission for government to do something on climate change. Things like the plastic bag tax in Britain, where basically, it was done, there wasn't a referendum, it was just introduced. Even in London, those of you who've heard me speak about this, I'm in London today, a city with a congestion charge. And the reason it has a congestion charge is simply that there wasn't a referendum. Government just did it. Ken Livingstone did it without asking people. It was unpopular, but because it worked, public transport was improved first. It was then introduced. Ken Livingstone got re-elected with 55% of the vote in London at his next mayoral election. In contrast, Manchester and Stockholm do not have a congestion charge. And the reason is they asked people and had a referendum. So there is a lot of latent permission. Business is just expected to do the right thing. What are the most significant changes in behavior in terms of attitudes? Okay. Do we know about how the growth in e-commerce affects different sectors differently? Gen Z surveys show trans rights are a huge generational issue for them. What are the implications for generational conflict over gender identity? Gosh, plenty of questions. Right. I think, obviously, the most significant changes, ways in which attitudes haven't changed, is that, ultimately people want the same things. They want economic growth, they want opportunity, generally liberal values, and the world goes on becoming more liberal despite its conflict. And some of those conflicts are because the world's becoming more liberal. I mean, we talk about generational change, and one of the things that we've noticed is this big divide, and I've noticed it in my own business. I'm 55. I've stayed in the business for 33 years, so I could make it the sort of company I wanted it to be when I joined in 1987. But of course, what I think is a right-on type of business, as it would have been when I joined in 87, because it's changed a lot, is not what people in their 20s now expect. And even on things like trans rights, people of my generation, 88% of us say we're completely straight. The figure for Gen Z is only 66%. So there are some big differences over things like trans rights. And those changes, I think, are just going to keep coming at us. What else have we got? On the divide question, regions where political and social divides are large, is it reasonable to think that even recent events won't heal those large global separations? Broadly, yes. And I think at the bottom of many of those divides are questions about the economy, ultimately. Who are the winners and losers, and who in particular in Western societies, and I'll include Latin America in that, who expected endless growth and were told that the middle classes were going to have a great future, and then it hasn't arrived, perhaps because the commodity boom is over, etc. So, you know, that is the fundamental question facing Europe. You know, it's a challenge in Britain, where we're sitting now. All those red wall seats who've lent their votes to Boris Johnson, people who are socially conservative but believe in government doing things for them, believe in very strongly in things like the NHS. You know, when is government going to deliver? Because if it doesn't, people will then become even more attracted to conspiracy theories, which we know quite a lot about at Ipsos MORI, and things like QAnon. And so, you know, yeah, those divides aren't going away, but it's really interesting to see that they are so strong in Latin America. Will there be a net zero fatigue? I think potentially, but I think people buy it. I think the point here is they just want somebody else to do it for them. They, you know, Britain, in a sense, is a, you know, many of you will know that Britain is a world leader in dealing with low carbon energy production. We make more of our electricity from renewables than any other country in the OECD. And we did that not by having a referendum or asking consumers if they wanted us to do it. The government decided to do it. It put up electricity prices a bit to subsidize the construction of wind farms. It changed some tax incentives. And then Britain, which is an island with plenty of room for wind farms, particularly at sea, has managed to achieve that. And consumers haven't really had to do anything except pay a bit more for their electricity. And so I think it's those sorts of changes, just, you know, moving to that recyclable packaging, looking at your distribution chain and taking out carbon, looking at your production chain and taking out carbon. People are just expecting that to happen. If you ask them to make a simple choice between economic recovery and protecting the environment, then of course they're split. But there's a lot of latent permission, and people accept carbon. They accept carbon as a key challenge. As I say, it's the one value that continues in this global study to unite the world. On trust, have you seen a general increase in trust in business? Yes, we have actually. In the places where we've checked it, we saw a surge in trust in government in the first half of the year as people looked for authority to do things. But actually, we have seen a rise in trust in business during 2020. We may go back to before, but people have been delighted to see business stepping up, you know, keeping food on the table, keeping supply chains going. They're enormously grateful. They can see, you know, they can see business trying to do the right thing. On mental health, we of course have been tracking people's experiences during lockdown with our colleagues at King's College London and others. We know that the working women on this call who've got children, who've had to look after children at home, will be the people who've mostly experienced problems with mental health. And we don't know what the longer term consequences of this are. We have a generation of children across the world who've missed out on a year's education. And that's been uneven in its impacts, with the burden falling most on poorer kids across the world. Those impacts will be present in terms of outcomes afterwards for a long time. And yeah, mental health, there is a mental health crisis. We're also more willing to talk about it, but it's certainly there. Am I aware of any other large surveys on similar topics that have come up with different responses and trends? No, not really, because I'd have probably told you about them if I have. But I think we need to keep looking, and it's always good to triangulate things. You know, as many of you know, one of the key mottos at Ipsos MORI is that if something is interesting, it's usually wrong. So we need to remember that. Other key questions: net zero fatigue, we've done. Impact of disinformation on perceptions, particularly relating to vaccine acceptance. We've looked at that specifically, and we found that 13% of the population believe that COVID-19 is simply a plot to vaccinate everybody. So it's only a minority, but certainly we found that heavy social media users are much more likely to buy into conspiracy theories and listen to disinformation. But on the other hand, a positive message for the tech companies on here, I don't know if Facebook's on the call, is that actually during the course of 2020, what we've seen is a fall in the proportion of people who say they've been exposed to disinformation. So at the start of the pandemic, about 47% of people in Britain said they'd seen fake news about the pandemic. Since then, that's fallen, and it's still okay. It's still about 22%, but it has roughly halved. And some of that is people like Facebook and Twitter taking action, whether it's just to put notices on Donald Trump's tweets, or whether it's just to remove conspiracy theorist groups entirely that are peddling dangerous theories about the virus. So I think it's interesting that tech, maybe 2020, despite being a year of disinformation, and indeed the head of the World Health Organization saying that disinformation is as dangerous as the virus, interestingly, I think we have got some signs that big tech is doing something about it. Some of you will say it's too little too late, but it is doing something. Any more questions coming through? Let's have a look. Trust in the media. What we've seen on trust in the media is actually, I didn't talk about it today because it's no change. If you're interested, do email me. There's my email address, and I can send you a presentation we've looked at particularly how attitudes to the media and consumption of the media, which obviously has changed, massive rise in news, but also comedy during lockdown, in massive news and comedy consumption. But actually trust in the media, in a study that we've been running for a long time, shows almost no change in Britain. It's different in a few other countries. Are any of the trends in conflict with each other? Well, I think there's a sort of trend to wanting to just sort of retreat from the world, drink oneself into oblivion, eat lots of comforting food, and then at the same time worrying about health. And certainly we saw more people exercising and more people drinking and smoking during the first lockdown. So there are some of those. But I think overall, in a way, you could say that people's behaviours seem to be, if anything, getting closer to some of their values, and there's potentially less dissonance. It will be interesting to see once people are sort of released from lockdowns, whether the say-do gap that we spend a lot of time looking at in our group called Ipsos Green Economy, which looks at consumers and their behaviour and sustainability, and that gap between being very worried about climate change etc., and then continuing to pollute and not really changing habits. But at the same time, ongoing massive growth in interest in plant-based food, so we'll see. On the American election, any comments in relation to the American election? Well, blimey, we could have spent the whole time talking about it. I think the first thing it shows, certainly on polling accuracy, remember you are talking to Britain's most accurate pollster. The British polls last year performed far better than the American polls have. So we were accurate to 0.3% for each party's share of the vote in our pre-election poll in Britain last year, which is far better than any of the American pollsters managed this time. So we may have learned our lessons from 2016. They clearly have some new lessons to learn. But in fairness to America, I think one of the things that was really challenging, has been really challenging about the American election for polling, but is also part of the phenomenon of the election, is the surge in turnout. And that's always really difficult for pollsters to deal with, because if you have people who don't normally vote telling you that they're suddenly going to vote, and this is the challenge we faced in the European referendum in Britain, where we had 51% the night before telling us they were going to vote leave. And when we looked at them, we could see loads of older working class people who didn't ever normally bother voting. And we had to make a judgment call about whether those people this time were exercised enough to get to the ballot box. What's just happened in America is that Donald Trump did brilliantly in mobilizing his base. And, he has very few policies, but of course, what he's doing is just showing, you don't like the world, you don't like these things, COVID, it's all fake news, all these people telling you to do these things, they don't care about you, I'm the person on your side. And it just shows how deeply divided America still is. And Joe Biden may be a normal president, but the country and the pressures that people are under that make Donald Trump so attractive are not going away. And those same pressures are present in many European countries, and indeed across Latin America. And so I think a lot of it, to me at least, has ultimately underneath it all economic challenges. People who are not seeing the growth that they were looking for in their lives, they're not turning out to be better off. Their children's futures don't look to be what they were hoping for. And that leads people to be very frustrated. So our governments have enormous challenges in the 2020s. Western Europe, spends more on social care and health and welfare than pretty much the rest of the world put together. And the question for Western Europe And the question for Bits of America is, can we afford to go on doing that? This is Angela Merkel's question. And so, those are the challenges we face. How do we find, productivity growth? How do we help all those people who were living in poverty, but in jobs in America and in Britain before this happened? And, some of those people are attracted to the politics like those of Donald Trump, or indeed the politics of Mr. Bolsonaro, even if populists very often in office turn out not to deliver. Any more? Let's have a look. On the economic impact of generations, on the global segments, which segment has been most hit hardest economically? It is the young. There's some data out yesterday. And so although people my age, 55, will find it harder to get a job if we lose our job during the crisis, the people who will be most affected, as in 2008, will be the young. And we will probably, unfortunately, be able to track the impact of this epidemic on their lives for probably for another 20 years. We could see the size of the recession that we're potentially seeing in some countries and some sectors and some markets will mean that those who've been particularly affected by it, it will actually have a knock-on effect on their earnings potential for potentially decades. And you could see people who were unemployed for a year in the 1980s in cohort studies, that is actually visible in their earnings even when they're in their 40s in some cases. So it is the young, and let's hope that the vaccine arrives quickly and we can actually take the crisis and use the positive bits, the bits about less commuting for some people, the bits about perhaps less centralized economies and more distributed economies, the bits about less pollution. Possibly those things might just improve the sum of human happiness. There might be some good to come out of it. I'm going to stop now. Thank you for that. The recording's available, the slides are available. There is much more data behind the slides, so do get in touch if you want any of that. And I hope you found it enjoyable. Please let us know. But thank you, and I'll stop the webinar now.